So now our job shifts a bit, although we laid a great groundwork for it in many ways by the comments and the votes and the discussion. And my apologies for having my back turned to somebody at every single point here. But the goals of our policy roundtable are to try to build from the discussion we've just had. So it's not to go back and talk about that trial, or anything. It's to try to say, how do we work together? What kinds of ideas do we have, policy recommendations, et cetera, for how the evidence can be applied in practice with patients, directly or indirectly, with insurers and others, to try to make sure we get to that goal, which is sustainable access to high-value care for all patients. And we may even tinker with those words because a key part of high-value care is the innovation that we want to see kind of continue. So we've got a new member of the table here. I'd like to introduce Harold Carter. Harold, do you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, my name's Harold Carter. I am a pharmacist by trade, so I'm a senior director within our clinical solutions area at Express Scripts. So our team is responsible for a few things. So our formulary, our utilization management tools, amongst a number of other things for the company.
So Harold, just to be clear off the bat, the PARPs as pills, will they come through your hands?
They will. So they will come through, and as you look at the debate and kind of what's going to come out of this, is it's going to restrict access and things of that nature. The thing we have to be clear about, and what we do not take lightly here at Express Scripts is, and we're right here on the campus, is putting clinical first. So, when you look at these products and what's in our PAs and things of that nature, we approve what's up here. And when you look at, I believe it's on PARS, we actually approve a few other things based on clinical literature outside of just the FDA approval. So we're always going to put clinical first, but it does kind of beg the question from a plan sponsor that, what am I paying for? So we've gone a lot over the details of the clinical validity, et cetera. Unfortunately, what some of the patients are going to have to go through. We have tools and things of that nature through our TRC pharmacists, things of that nature, nutritionists to really work with patients and their prescribers. But when you look at it from a cost perspective, how do we really actually identify those patients that need the treatment, those that don't and would benefit from something else? And then conversely, how do we work with pharma to really start looking at these drugs and really start leveraging different tools such as, utilization management programs, formulary, but value-based contracting to really sort of pinpoint that and manage that cost. Because when you look at a plan sponsor, they're not only having to figure out how to cover the high cost of this, but how to cover the high cost of hemophilia, how to cover the high cost of other specialty medications, et cetera, and something's got to give. So we have to find that right balance across the healthcare system. And the goal isn't beyond popular belief that you hear in the public for Express Scripts to block coverage for everything. We want to make sure that patients have access, but making sure that it's at an affordable price.
All right, so I'm going to, you've laid a nice, groundwork for us to come back to, but I'm going to try to build there by starting with the evidence that we had and that we need and working through some of the clinical issues.
Perfect.
And peaking, I guess, in some way when we're talking about insurance coverage and pricing. So I go back to the beginning of actually when ICER started to think about this topic. And I remember the excitement. Well, we've got 3 PARP inhibitors. That means we should be able to compare them to each other and help patients and doctors do some indirect comparisons and come out with something that would, in a sense, be helpful. We start to find that the studies were done so differently with the patients kind of from a different walk of life, different lines of therapy getting into the studies. The ways that the outcomes were measured were different in some cases. And we ended up not being able to do, in a sense, our bread and butter, which is a kind of indirect comparison. And these are drugs that have the same mechanism, same basic mechanism of action. So I want to start with the patients. From your guys' perspective, and maybe this doesn't, occur to too many patients in some way. And I'll wrap in the clinical experts very quickly, but I can imagine a sense of frustration, a certain amounts of frustration at so many kind of not cleanly lined up clinical trial development pathways that just make the decision-making around which drug for which patients that much more complicated. And I know that patients want to find the greatest doctor and trust that doctor, but does the, in a sense, the inadequacy of the evidence to help us make some of these finer distinctions, how do patients experience that, or not?
One thing, is this the first time that ICER has looked at a treatment for ovarian cancer?
Yes, it is.
Okay, that's what.
Do we seem that naive?
No. I won't use the word naive, but I will say this. I've been around the disease 20 years, and the first 15, 16 of those, there was so little change in treatments available. As you well know, bevacizumab didn't come on until a few years ago, and the PARP inhibitors have just been in the last 3 years. So you kind of have to put this all in context. There's been a lack of progress until recently. And in addition to that, there's been this huge explosion about understanding our disease. There are so many subtypes of our disease. You probably had 5 ovarian cancer survivors in this room, and you probably had at least 3 different subtypes. So all of our treatments are different. So all that knowledge has been growing and growing and growing, and we've gotten frustrated that nothing has come along on the treatment side until now. So that's why I think you might have been a little bit surprised when we walked in here and we said this is too premature and we don't like it. Well, it's not that we don't appreciate what ICER's doing. It's just that we feel like this is the only thing we've got. It's a little sliver of hope for us. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you that in 20 years, that sliver of hope has not been there. So that's why we've been so passionate about it. And we are frustrated by clinical trial designs. And we've gotten involved, some of our patient advocacy groups, we've gotten involved sitting on research panels, going right to the source and saying, look, you've got to include this, this, and this for our patients. We need those quality of life determinants. So we're getting more active as a community, but sure, we're frustrated.
That's very helpful. And actually, your point even makes me think of our contextual consideration of the first treatment that ever offered any improvement. In a way, it probably feels that way for patients with ovarian cancer because it's been so long since there was any kind of major step change in treatment. So I can appreciate that.
Yeah, definitely. And when I address the fact that there are so many different subtypes, for example, those of us who have a hormonally driven cancer rather than a genetically driven cancer, these things, PARP inhibitors, probably are not going to be a benefit to women that have the particular cancer that I have. But you can see 10 women with the same subtype that I have, and they'll all respond, or most of them will respond differently to the platinum drugs. So we're hoping there's going to be something else out there. And while we're gaining all this information about the mechanisms that are driving our cancers, we need that research to couple with it to get treatments.
All right. Betsy, go ahead. I bet you would like to.
What you said first is, I think, the most important thing. There is no decision tree that a patient can use. You have to rely on not just the knowledge, but the art that the doctor brings. And so you have to trust your doctor who will say, I really think there are 2 trials out there, but I really think this one is better. And then convince you. And you do rely on your doctor, even though it's supposed to be collaborative medicine. When you get diagnosed with cancer, I think of it like a nightmare that I used to have, that I was back at my high school, and I was about to walk into a classroom. I could see it very clearly, and I discovered that it's the final exam, and I haven't opened the book. And when I sit down, I find out that all the answers have to be in German, and that's what cancer is like. You're in an entirely different culture. So it's all the more important that you find the doctor you like. Now, I'm educated. I live near Boston. I'm very fortunate. Most women don't have that choice, and so they just follow what the doctor says.
So let's ask the doctors. Do you guys mind if I call you Andrea and Matt at this point? Matt or Matthew?
Matt's fine.
Matt's fine. So ultimately, people are going to ask you, what are the key differences in patients' kind of characteristics, hopes, desires, et cetera, that would help you pick one PARP drug over another? I mean, I know we didn't do the direct comparison, so the art, if you will, comes back to you guys. Is there any reason to think that these PARPs are different from each other? Do clinical experts, do they just think it's just going to be a matter of time and all these different studies are kind of hunting around the same territory, probably having a hard time recruiting patients now? But are we headed towards a place where we think one PARP is another PARP?
I don't think at this point we have any significant data really saying one is better than the other, and there's some more that are still in the pipeline where you hear rumors maybe this one is better, but we really don't have that information, and so I think it's just being honest with the patient, saying, you know, we have 2 that are FDA approved for this, and, you know, these are the ones that are approved for maintenance. You don't have any great data suggesting one is better than the other. The side effect profile is slightly different, so if you had someone who had significant issues with platelet counts, you maybe lean towards one versus the other. But other than that, at this point, at least data that I'm aware of.
Can I ask a question to the doctors? I know with some drugs that you get, they disqualify you for future trials. Is there any difference between the 3 PARP inhibitors in terms of that?
They would all be equal in disqualifying you for further PARP trials typically.
Okay. Well,
But yes, I don't think there'd be any difference about that.
well, I had a PARP inhibitor plus BKM 120, well,
Yep.
the trial that was stopped because it was awful. And then,
There are some drugs that were thought to be PARP inhibitors that later really weren't very good PARP inhibitors. That probably wouldn't preclude you, but
I thought I was taking Olaparib plus something. And then several years later, I got on playing Olaparib.
So, and I know you're involved in a lot of investigations. So, you know, one of the things that ICER has often done is come out with recommendations around the kinds of research, the kinds of outcome measures that need to be built into research. What do you think are the critical needs for the research agenda here to inform your decision making?
yeah, so I think that the tricky part here is that I think all these drugs work fairly well. I was talking to Don a little bit, you know, I live this stuff every day, and it's so complicated. And I'm a high volume provider for ovarian cancer patients. I see probably, you know, the most in the state of Missouri, with one of my partners probably being right there with me. And we still sit and he and I argue, and our whole group of 8 GYN oncologists argue these points all the time, which I'm amazed that this group can pick up a disease de novo and really have a pretty good grasp of it in a short order. Because I still don't think I completely understand all the differences. Because you look at the package inserts, and that's a slice of the data that's out there. You know, we just had 4 big abstracts from ESMO last week that really changes my thought from what I thought the week prior. So it is such a moving target. To answer your question, you know, I'm still assimilating the data from last week, and then trying to figure out, you know, because we had some quality of life data that came out last week.
Right.
We had some more maintenance data that came out. My take-home message is they're probably all about the same, as Andrea said. And we're really looking beyond that. We're looking to what am I going to combine them with? Is it going to be immunotherapy plus PARP is really the next big step forward? We all like steps forward, and that's really where we're at. We're kind of beyond picking flavor A, B, or C. Is that a fair statement? Yeah.
Great. But I think, just to throw a softball to you, because it certainly serves our needs, and I think as far as we hope to help, and NCCN and other groups too, to the extent that the development pathways of different companies can define and describe patient eligibility. They don't have to go after the same patient subpopulations, but to be able to do good indirect comparisons, we need those patients described in the same way and the outcome measures to be measured in the same way. So, I mean, you know, we had some struggles just in terms of the types of patients who were being brought into trials and how well they were described. So I assume that that's still, as you said, trying to tease out these subpopulations when there might be just a handful of all the different varieties can make it really challenging for everybody.
Yeah, I think it goes back to, you know, the original studies. They're just looking for a signal. Did it work or not?
Right.
And had they known it was going to work so well, they would have done the quality of life measurements from the get-go to really show this. But you invest the least amount of money to see what's going to happen. And, you know, as further trials got developed, they got more refined. You went away from investigator-initiated or investigator assessments to true independent review. I mean, it's all kind of an evolution
Right.
in a company wanting to invest more because they know the return's there. It's a business decisions that all these things are made. So we want the best data possible. It's really expensive. And so, we can't separate the two things.
Right.
And as I try to design a trial and I try to get my trial budget there, I cut things out all the time.
And all other people do is say another questionnaire, another survey, right?
I want to get my trial finished as quickly as I can.
That too.
So I loosen up the eligibility criteria where it maybe wasn't the same as the other guy.
Good point. Is there anything else from your perspective? I want to move to maintenance therapy questions in a second, but before, just in terms of the general area around the clinical research design agenda between patients and clinical experts, again, top priority things that you think as a message going out to the manufacturing and the clinical research community that we should highlight? We've covered some of it, so if anything comes up later, certainly think of it. Can you think of anything, Andrew? Okay. All right, so let's talk about maintenance.
But I guess I would say
go ahead,
the
sorry.
top primary thing is, I don't think we can get overall survival benefit.
Right.
We need to probably stop talking about it, because it's not going to be there for these drugs typically, because of such prolonged post-progression therapies that we offer patients. And if you offer drug A, and then drug B is the exact same drug, but you offer that second, you're going to have the same benefits overall when you have overall survival. So the crossing over really makes this focus. We all want the best quality data we can get. I know around the table, everybody says, I want to have this super high quality data before I can make a decision. We're not going to get it in ovarian cancer. It's very, very unlikely unless we invest in a breast cancer sized trial with 4,000 patients. And we're not going to do that. We can't afford it. So we have to set our bars differently. And that's really my word to groups such as this and things that just, our expectations can't be that we can have level 1 evidence for all the decisions we're going to make.
Right.
I wish we could, but it's just not practical.
Well, we're all part of this kind of interesting phase of evolution around what's a good enough outcome between overall survival, progression-free survival, and this will come in waves. But what's also interesting, I'm sure that ASCO does this, because if you talk to multiple myeloma or other disease areas where you're getting a more chronic and long-term outcome, some of the same issues arise. But you still have clinical experts who think that overall survival needs to remain the gold standard for the clinical research community, even with longer term. And they talk about doing sequential studies instead of kind of doing a head-to-head and then just kind of, the crossover drops you out of the trial, really doing sequential studies, which do take longer, but at least you'll kind of learn, is it better to use a PARP first and then chemo, or chemo first and then PARP, those kinds of things. So anyway, interesting stuff. So,
Can I add one comment?
Oh, absolutely. I was going to say, for you guys, because I'm going to have my back to you a lot, if you have a question or a comment, please go ahead and put
I
your...
agree with that. And I think it's what Dan
put your
said
tag
earlier
up.
about not being biased towards level 1 randomized controlled trials. I think there needs to be initiatives and pushes that we didn't see here today for good observational studies. Following up over long terms and all the nuances that you talk about. I mean, that takes time and money too, but that may be the best you're able to do.
Well, the long-term 5-year survival patients don't end up in the package insert, so you're not getting to see some of these things. A lot of that data is out there, but what you're kind of asked to work on is what's submitted to the FDA.
Right.
And there's, you could get lost in a mound of data too.
Right.
That I try to assimilate every day, and I can't.
Yeah.
To what I was gonna say, to what extent is Mayo or WashU or other leading gynonc centers pooling data from across the country to share the kind of lived experience of patients? I mean, you might call it a registry, but I would consider it something deeper than that.
I think
where is that
initiative and these other outcomes, large system, EHR, holy grail data sets are really hopefully the answer. And
but the community's relatively small. I mean, to be honest, the advocacy organizations or the clinical leaders are going to have to self-organize it and not wait for EPIC to solve the problem.
But I would say that we're interested in the basic science. We want to find a little home run here and there.
Yep.
Big population health isn't where a lot of us investigators are focusing our effort. But I know that's out there. I know it's growing, and I hope EHR helps answer some of these things.
Got it.
You can try to sort out, Is it G-BRCA is really the only group that we're seeing this big? Is there QLs, well-adjusted life years, really that population? You can see it. We saw what it cost them. You can tie a lot of things together with big data, but even the ASCO's large data set program that they were hoping to tie to EHR is still struggling. Now, this is 6-7 years and going.
Right.
But I think that is something that our industry partners are really pushing it to, because they want that data to see, what the population impact is.
Yep. So I wanted to turn to maintenance therapy, partly because it's a fascinating clinical area for a lot of reasons. But again, across different cancer domains, the evidence around maintenance therapy and the way that insurers interpret it can be a real flashpoint of conflict. The challenges are many, so I'd like to circle back to think a little bit more around the use of these drugs in maintenance, where we are with the evidence today, we've already kind of talked about. But again, if you're advising an insurer on how to create sensible coverage policies around maintenance, can maintenance be overdone, for instance? Or should some boundaries be put around the way that maintenance therapy is used clinically and from an insurer perspective? Andrea, what do you think?
I would say, like we were kind of talking about earlier, right now it's FDA approved for all comers. I do think there is a subgroup of patients that are probably likely going to benefit much more from maintenance therapy, those who had, a nice response to platinum therapy, but perhaps had some residual disease. Their prior disease-free interval was not that long, so kind of trying to improve that, versus someone who maybe went 3 years disease-free, had a complete response to carbotaxol, where you expect them to have another long disease-free interval. Is the benefit of maintenance for that patient the same? Because perhaps if they recurred, they could then take the PARP inhibitor. So there are questions, I think, regarding when do we best use these. Again, to have, in an ideal world, some sort of comparison between using it as maintenance or switch therapy after a platinum versus waiting till recurrence and using it. I mean, we don't have that data.
Yeah. Betsy, please. Betsy, can you just pull that a little closer? I want to make sure folks can hear
Is it
you.
still true that the study showed that treating earlier rather than later makes no difference?
Well, we have one study that looked at CA125, and CA125 typically will predict a recurrence about 2 to 3 months prior to when it shows up on a CAT scan, which is about 2 to 3 months prior when it shows up clinically, like you start to get bloating or I get pain. So it may give you as much as a 4 to 6 month lead time. And the one trial that was most quoted was done in England, where one group got CA25 checked, so get that early indicator of disease, versus the other one waited until they had symptoms. In fact, both groups did equally the same, or equally poorly, we might say. But the treatment paradigms in England are quite a bit different. You get 2 or 3 lines of chemotherapy and you're done, typically. So we've had a little bit of a hard time fully adopting the mantra of not following C25. The key there, though, we did learn that you probably can wait to start therapy because you have some time in some patients. Like I think one of you said, I took some time off even though I had disease. That's a very reasonable thing to do. We have some ability to do that. And that's where the debate in maintenance really falls. And it's not pure maintenance, these trials. I know they're called maintenance, but it's really switch therapy, where some of these patients got their chemotherapy and their disease only went down part way, yet they were allowed to be on a maintenance type trial. It's really switching therapy to a new therapy.
Agent, right.
And those patients, I support this maintenance treatment concept, or your maintenance treatment, maintenance therapy. I guess the FDA uses the term maintenance therapy. I support probably those patients getting it. The CR patients, those that had their disease and went down to nothing, I'm not sure about that population. I don't know that we have enough evidence to say we definitely should treat those patients. It'd be much better to see if we had a trial done such as you said earlier. The ideal trial would be a watch and wait group versus maintenance. We don't have that data because my guess is they're probably fairly similar. But the way the trials were designed is what ends up in the package label.
Right. The other thing that happens, and I don't mean to cast aspersions to a certain extent, but it's not in a manufacturer's natural interest to do studies to demonstrate that you don't need to do maintenance or you can stop it at some point. or you can wait. It's harder to fund those, and so there are other funders who can step in and hopefully help fill that
But it was
gap,
also borne out
but
here
it's
in our
tough.
interpretation of the data. We had a placebo trial versus maintenance. We all thought, boy, this data looks great. The hazard ratios are 0.2, 0.3. But it was compared to placebo. When you compare something to historic controls with
Right.
chemotherapy,
Right.
the data was of lower quality, it didn't look as good. But in fact, that's really the population we feel is the right population to treat. Because you can follow those patients, you know whether they're benefiting or not.
Yeah.
So a little bit of, I want to say smoke and mirrors a little bit, but the maintenance strategy is somewhat genius on the fact of the pharmaceutical company to focus on that population, because you can really pick a winner pretty quickly, or show that your drug's
Show that-
active very quickly.
Right, right. So one thing, oh, please, Susan, yeah.
I want to take this off track just a little bit
Sure.
based on something
Sure.
Matt brought up. CA 125. I noticed in the report, there was a section on other ways to save money, other cost.
We're going to come to that, yeah,
Oh,
go
are
ahead.
we? Well,
But
then
no,
I can
but if you
wait.
have one,
Okay,
shoot it
yeah.
up now.
CA 125 and monitoring.
Okay,
Um,
please.
That's a real, they've shown that perhaps it does not show that much benefit to monitor a woman once she's gone into remission to keep monitoring her. And I noticed in the report that that was a suggestion, that we not do monitoring CA 125s and follow-on CT scans on a regular basis. I have a real issue with that as a patient. You get into remission, best feeling in the world.
Yeah.
Imagine you're walking on a tightrope. You know you're going to fall off that tightrope. The only safety net you have is that CA 125. In the majority of patients, it's a good indicator. Happens to be an excellent indicator for me. Had I not had the ability to have that CA 125 on a 3-month or a 6-month basis, I never would have known that I'd had a recurrence. No way, because I had no symptoms for 5 full years. And I was able to watch my CA 125 and recognize how large the disease was getting, how much it was growing, even though they couldn't find it. And I could stay in a wait and watch. And for a lot of women, that CA 125 is the biggest safety net they've got. It's their only security. So I just want to say, think about that one.
All right. We're definitely going to come back, certainly to the cost-saving opportunities to make room for innovation. Something that may or may not be a major issue right now for clinicians and patients, but I wanted to make sure if we should mention it more. We haven't talked that much about the tumor testing. So, I mean, are there insurance barriers to getting the tumors, tested, the genetic basis of these tumors? Is there any barriers that these days get in the way of the clinical experts making appropriate decisions?
Yeah, I would say definitely yes, especially the barrier is you usually need to make a phone call and do a peer-to-peer and spend your time to do it, and you usually can convince them that that's the right thing to do. It's usually often they want a different flavor of the test, or they want a limited test rather than an expanded test.
But
It
today,
usually
basically,
can be done.
is the genetic testing basically the part of care for every single patient, or
Based
not?
on 4 different authoritative bodies, it's the standard of care to offer genetic testing and should be covered. So somatic testing of a tumor, though, is a little bit different. The problem is people sometimes are, through this evolution of olaparib and then rucaparib and niraparib, so things have changed as we've gone down this, so it's a bit of a moving target for some of the payers to keep up to. So often you have to convince them, no, I don't need to do this now, or I do need to do this, and that's been some of the bureaucracy barriers.
Okay, got it.
Or that your experience in.
No, I think that's very true, and I think, you can go back and use possibly some old tumor tissue from initial surgical diagnosis, but if they've had multiple recurrences, we like to get a fresh tissue sample, which means, possibly a CT-guided biopsy or something like that, which may or may not be covered. And so there definitely are some barriers to tumor testing.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yes,
about
Rena,
that.
please.
Would it be advantageous from patient access perspective to have the tumor typing in the label for the drug?
Well, so now it's disappeared with the new indications.
Right.
I see.
The tumor typing, the requirement to have it. Yeah, as a practicing clinician, I want less barriers rather than more. But as managing society and managing the purse strings, yes, having the right patients getting the right drug at the right time makes sense. But sometimes that, you need some wiggle room, I guess. Is that?
I think yes, because then it would also get hard if you saw a patient who kind of fit the clinical picture of someone who would likely respond well to department quicker, but maybe didn't have the coverage to get the tumor testing. Does that mean that you can't give her the drug? So you have to.
It's hard because, BRCA1 and 2 are part of the story. Then we have DICER1, we have RAD51C, we're learning all these things all the time. And it's when you're heavily into the research standpoint, you want to say, well, this makes sense. I want to do this. And we like that it's open as far as accrual or ability to get access to the drugs now, because we feel like we can put the right patient on at the right time. But put that in the general community where somebody sees one ovarian cancer patient a year, I don't know, and that's where it gets difficult.
It's exactly this trade-off.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think tumor testing is necessarily the be-all and end-all, because different parts of the tumor can show different histologies. And tumors can mutate. So something that appeared when you test the initial tumor, you might be only testing the left end. And when there's a recurrence, it might be a different type. So,
Betsy, I'll tell you, I would guess that less than 1% of practicing doctors in the United States know their science as well as you do.
1% is high.
I said less than 1%, I said. All right, Harold, you're back up to bat, okay? We've got, what, 15? 15 minutes left to,
Can I ask one?
Ryan, please.
Just related to that in dealing with insurers. Could you speak a little bit, if experience with patients who are uninsured? And how?
So the nice thing is actually patients that are have limited resources. There's much more patient assistance programs available to them than patients with commercial insurance that get denied. I don't know. We have the advocates here from the companies, but I believe that to be true. When you have a commercial payer or a Medicare patient, sometimes getting those assistance programs are much harder than a self-pay patient that can be fully qualifying for a patient assistance program.
So I asked, and I will say, Rena and I tried to ask about the patient assistant, and I'll disclose it now. My cousin died 7 years ago of ovarian cancer, and she was a divorced mom of 2 boys. She only lasted 2 years. She did not get to see her youngest son graduate, and she was uninsured. She worked 2 part-time jobs, and when she was first diagnosed, she did not qualify for the patient assistance programs because her 2 part-time jobs put her income too high. So it was not until almost a year after her diagnosis, when she could no longer work, that she started to qualify for things. So my frustration today is related to some of that. Frustration with there are some people that have with insurance there's problems, but there's problems with Medicaid, there's problems with being uninsured, but even having access. Who knows? I mean, she didn't last 2 years. And I think she would have, and I think she would have been able to see her son graduate if our country had better access for everybody.
And we've seen that with our working poor, especially if they have a farm or a house. They have to impoverish themselves in order to qualify. And that, this financial toxicity is profound. And you could say, well, boy, they should have bought insurance, but, I don't know. I mean, I do think, obviously speaking globally here, getting everybody insured is clearly the route to fixing some of these problems, but the patient assistance programs don't help everybody equally. We have a lot of barriers, and especially when things are really expensive.
and also, you could say that somebody with some means can get insurance, but the insurance you get if you're in a rural area or, beyond a major metropolitan area often won't cover the big cancer hospitals. So you may have insurance, but insufficient.
Well, a divorced mother, too, is making choices, and her own insurance is probably falling off rather than paying for her kids, and it's a disgrace in this country.
Can I ask a question about the qualifications of physicians or providers to treat this condition and make sound judgments about treatment and support patients in navigating this condition? So it's a relatively rare condition. Is this a condition in which the choice for patients should be limited to centers that have the skills and capabilities? So you've mentioned it a little bit, like, well, if I only see one patient who fits this profile a year, I would argue, right, from a policy perspective, are you qualified to actually fully participate in the treatment for that individual person? And this is a policy issue that we as a country, right, or states or Medicare, a little more difficult on the commercial side, could influence, right?
Probably the biggest case in point is Norway. You could get your surgery at any Norwegian hospital, your ovarian cancer surgery. And the Minister of Health in Norway has full authority over the health system, the public health system. I think it was she that looked at it and said, these 3 hospitals do great, these 5 do poorly, these 3 are the only one that get to take care of ovarian cancer now. And that happened with a stroke of a pen.
Right.
And they saw their rates go up, their survival go up, and improve things. So centralized care clearly makes sense from a surgical standpoint. I don't think we have quite the level of evidence to say that drug delivery should be necessarily centralized.
On the oncology side, okay.
But, part of the reason I have conflicts is I feel an obligation to get out and educate, our providers across the country. I can't do that on my own, and I think that, yes, it's a conflict when you take money from pharmaceutical companies, but hopefully we're part of the greater good and educating people, and then also letting the low-volume providers know that they can call me, run something by, not necessarily have to have that patient travel 2.5 hours. We've set up a network within our 350-mile radius where, I have 3 phone calls I need to make when I get out of here to medical oncologists asking me what they should do next on their patient. And that's a system that
works.
It works, but there's no reimbursement for that.
Right.
It's just the right thing to do.
Well, it's part, for those of us that work in academic medicine, it's part of the role of an academic medical center.
Well, there are a certain number of women who are diagnosed with ovarian cancer because they've gone in for surgeries for something else. If you've got someone opened up, you're going to debulk if you find cancer. You're not going to say, I'll close them up and then send them to Boston.
Or should you? I'll ask a question.
Guidelines, we're trying to do other things to where that doesn't happen so frequently.
Right.
I'm sorry,
Exactly.
does
Okay,
that happen
all right.
a lot?
But you know what happened in Norway? Norway, they didn't say you couldn't do it. They said we won't pay you to do it. And that completely changed behavior.
That changed behavior. All right, speaking of behavior and payment, Harold. Okay, so now we're back to what the insurers are going to do with this evidence. So sometimes I create straw men. Here's a straw man. We've heard that there's no evidence. Clinical experts are basically feeling like these PARPs are interchangeable. That's a strong word. So does what a payer do based on that is to say, well, that's good for us. We can negotiate really tough and only pick one of these and get a really low price and not cover the other 2? In cancer, I know there are certain boundaries around which you can't. So why don't you just talk through how you can use evidence of where there's no evidence to distinguish the effectiveness. What are the parameters around what you can do with coverage, and what do you want to do with coverage? How will you use evidence to actually try to create a lower price, lower cost for patients, for everybody?
Yeah, I think there's a few ways you can look at it. One, I think if you look at the way that we manage it today with NRPA policies and some of those other tools, it's not going to change. I think obviously as more data comes out, I think it's pointing towards it. There's probably some similarities to PARP inhibitors moving forward, but not completely right now, right? So once that comes, that gives that competition for us to really start demanding better pricing in the marketplace.
So let me just interrupt real quickly. So
Yep.
as it stands today with the evidence, would you be able to, or would you want to, go out and pick 1 or 2 out of the 3 and not cover the third?
So at this point, I don't think anything shows that there's that similarity between all of them at this point. Now, that may change as as more additional information comes out, but what we see today is that there's still some differences between the 2. I know that there was some data that was just recently approved, which we're still under the works of looking at and seeing what additional steps we can take there. But really, this shouldn't have to be an adversarial conversation. It shouldn't have to be Express Scripts or other PBMs having to really take a hard stance to get the price down, although we've shown in other classes we can and we will. But this is really getting manufacturers to step up and have a conversation on okay, what is the outcomes of your drug? Is there, and if the responses aren't there, what sort of tools do we put in place to keep plan sponsors that are footing the bill for largely for the part of this, footing the bill some sort of reimbursement if they don't respond, if a patient doesn't respond to therapy. You see this YCAS net with approvals that we just talked about that says gives us a little bit more ability to prescribe this, but we see that the data doesn't actually show that it's really good in that YCAS net. So what plan sponsors and what PBMs is really take a look at the data and narrow it down to where patients it clinically makes sense. And for the others, we'll have to work to do there. But fundamentally, when everything we're talking about, the reason why we're having this discussion is because the price of these products are so drastically high for the marketplace that we can't afford it. So I think if we're willing to really have an honest discussion and really start looking at the price point of these with our manufacturer partners, it really changes the dynamic. So, when we talk about, and I'll throw this out here too, is we've talked a lot about this discussion not being patient-centric. We just went down the discussion of patients not being able to afford their medications, going through assistance programs. When you get it to a price that makes sense, right, a lot of those discussions change. If you look at historically outside of oncology, you look at hepatitis C, the price of that came down significantly over the years. We've been able to work with our plan sponsors and get the cost down deeply.
Harold, I'm going to push you though. The only reason the Hep C prices went down is because you decided not to cover one of the two drugs. So I'm not suggesting.
That's true. But
that's true.
That was true. But if you took a look at it last year, we were actually able to bring other products back on the formulary. You see more drugs coming to the marketplace.
So play this out in this particular area. And believe me, I'm not trying to suggest that not covering one is the only way to get better value. But I'm wondering, what do you have left in your holster?
Yep.
So these drugs are all around 150,000 per year, right? Total? 150,000 a year?
Around there.
So what keeps it from being 200,000 next year, or for the next drug, because all these immunotherapy plus PARP trials are going to add a $200,000 a year drug onto a $150,000 a year drug.
Yeah.
So and you guys face the difficult task of kind of doing what society wants you to do, which is to keep healthcare affordable while supporting innovation and access to a lot of different drugs. What do you do? So
yeah, it's a good question. I think if you look at outside of PARP inhibitors, what we've been able to do over the last few years with some of our, for example, our oncology care value program, is really focus on looking at value-based contracting and how patients respond to treatment and being able to bring costs down from that perspective. So we have tools in place that are able to go down that route with us without us needing to use formula exclusions and things of that nature. And we continue to look at how to expand that. But there are ways that when you have a good partner from a manufacturer perspective, you're able to take a realistic approach, look at those products, and figure out some solutions, even if there isn't necessarily always direct competition. So we do have tools in our arsenal. We have used those over the last few years without having to use exclusions or anything of that nature. But with that being said, as more of that competition does come to the marketplace and there is that similarity between products, if we need those, we will use them. And you'll see that across other PBMs as well.
And if you could get a much lower price, so let's say like hepatitis C, you were able to cut the price in half in a couple of years, how would patients see any of that directly or indirectly?
So a few things, right? There's many more treatment options that are out there from a plan sponsor perspective. When you're able to bring down the costs, that directly impacts from a plan sponsor's ability on the premiums and things that they charge, right, going year over year. So there's a lot of different ways that a member is going to actually see the true benefits of that.
All right,
the specific member themselves may not see it though, right?
Well, so here's the...
I mean, their copay is going to be the same.
Well, there's...
In reality, you're right. The group plan probably will have more options.
Potentially, but
The
you also
individual
have to
may
think about growth, year-over-year growth of premiums and deductibles. As those prices go up, if we're not able to do that, the plan sponsor's not going to necessarily eat all the costs. Some of that's going to be passed to a patient. That's what happens when year-over-year growth of premiums. But if you're able to curb some of that spend, that's where members are actually seeing the difference there.
Kind of curious if you guys think about this very much. There are lots of rules that protect, there are certain protected classes of drugs that make it more difficult for payers or impossible, illegal for payers not to cover them. And some policymakers feel that those restrictions should be done away with to improve competition, if you will. So from a clinical expert perspective, if the only way to get the price down was to allow health insurers to not cover one or two of the current PARPs or more of them, how do you make that balance in your head between wanting to have access to all of them, but feeling like we want lower prices, and if excluding some is the only way to get there, maybe we should do that? What are your own thoughts about that?
I would say first, let's be careful about blocking, saying we're just not going to cover something. It's not covering something when there are clinically appropriate alternatives.
Right.
So I just want to make sure of that. There are some times where there's comments where there's a class that's not covered or something of that nature. I want to make sure that there's a difference there.
Right.
That's
Right.
clear.
Or step therapy or something like that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, just to respond to your comment before when you said, well, we said the drugs were basically equal. I didn't exactly say that. I said in the setting
I
of
know.
research, they're basically equal, but I'd like to have choices. This drug may be better for this patient. You know, there are clinical scenarios where we can see meaningful differences. Are they enough? If the drug was twice as much, that I would choose that drug? No way. I mean, we would like to use the cheaper option when we could.
Yeah.
And I think, but there are clinical meaningful differences that right now,
Yeah.
I would,
You would want to
don't
retain.
use cost to drive that.
Yeah.
Because even the small differences in costs don't end up back to the patient. That,
We were
you
just
don't
talking
see it
about
back
that.
to the patient very much.
Although I think I'll echo what he said, which was, yes, and.
It will, but
it
I
will
think we all
overall,
need to think
but-
globally, or.
Yeah, but you're right,
Understand.
but you're right otherwise.
And keep in mind, there's, as you look at PARP inhibitors, there's 2 now that have maintenance treatment. There's some other things coming down the line. So is that true future state? I mean, like you said, wait a week, things change. So.
Right. Well, if I had to guess, if we were to have this meeting 2 years from now, there will be many more treatments available. There will be even new combinations, like immunotherapy combinations added, and the average cost of treatment will be double what it is today. Average. That's the future I see. I'm not saying that that's unavoidable or that it's necessarily bad, but if you look at other cancer areas, this is the way it's going, and a lot of people are wrestling with how we manage the sustainability of that if the science is taking us towards combination therapies with very expensive treatments.
And when we start looking at combination therapies, you've already seen this in the oncology space where, you have melanoma. You have one product, there's a combo product that puts on it, the cost of it doubles, but yet outcomes are 30% better. Is that a realistic way of pricing something? Absolutely not. So there's going to be areas of that where there's going to be some strong steps in the marketplace to get those under control, and I would see that happening within immunotherapy.
Yeah. The other thing that, ICER deals in a lot in terms of thinking about pricing and cost to a certain extent is the maintenance issue. So as we moved from an acute treatment phase to a maintenance therapy phase, the overall costs of care just escalate year after year after year, and whether that should lead to some reconsideration around pricing or in some way, because even our analyses in our report now showed that the shorter term treatment, if you will, was more cost effective than the maintenance therapies. So it's just something that the field will continue to wrestle with, is how to create sustainable access and to continue with the innovation if we're going to be lumping these things together.
One thing that I didn't hear from the testimonials from some of the manufacturers that were up here was, as that maintenance and all this treatment comes along, why is the price so high, right? If it's maintenance, you're making your money over a patient being used over a longer period of time.
Don't you
so there's
patients
also
like that
things
term?
like that over.
We hear it too. You get to be milked for more money over time.
Right. So but that's a realistic question, right? Is historically it's patient only survives. Overall survival is only 3 or 4 months or something, and so there's an inherent cost that's associated with that, and we have to make our money back. But what you're seeing is there's more and more treatment options being put on the table, but yet the price keeps going up longer and longer. Patients are living longer, which is fantastic. We love that, but there's not this correlation all the time between the two. Now, we've been able to come to some terms with some work with many manufacturers on this, but this is a growing issue that needs to be addressed as well.
All right, I'm going to note the clock and start a process where people are going to start to be able to give some final comments. And I would like to start with the policy roundtable and invite each of you to give a 2-sentence final statement. And each sentence needs to be different. One sentence. Now this is like you're in high school or middle school. So one sentence should hopefully be your kind of summary, kind of what you really want the ICER final report to reflect, and the message that you want to hammer home, et cetera. The other is something that we've wanted to do, and I've not left enough time to do justice to it, but I'd love your idea on what waste is there in the care of patients with ovarian cancer that should just be eliminated to help make headroom for the kinds of innovation that we want to see and that we know may be very expensive. So opportunities for savings that would help the overall health system make more room for innovation. So that would be one sentence on something or things you can think of, with lots of commas if you want, and the other a kind of final thought. Andrea, I'm sorry that you're first.
Okay.
Actually, believe it or not, you'll like being first by the time they're done.
Okay, this is okay. No, I think bottom line, PARP inhibitor therapy shows a lot of promise and is a novel therapy that really changes things for a proportion of our patients. In terms of waste, I think we could probably spend less time imaging and searching for kind of asymptomatic elevated CA-125s.
Okay. So you'll get another crack at this, Susan. See, I told you you would. Great, Matt.
Obviously echo those comments. I probably could put this a little better, but I definitely think we're making slow progress. It's not no progress. And it's a very exciting time to take care of patients with ovarian cancer, and this is one part of it, but this cost-conscious area completely has to be addressed if we can sustain. And I'm very excited about these new combinations, et cetera. This is a very long run-on sentence. Is what
That's all right. There are semicolons.
But again, there has to be some mechanism within our government to allow Medicare, Medicaid to negotiate. Obviously, we have a private company that's doing pretty well at it, but we're doing nothing with Medicare and Medicaid. The other issue we have is a lot of physicians are making choices on what drug to give based on what they're reimbursed personally.
We didn't talk about that, I know.
A lot of these small groups, you said, oh, nobody's giving PARP inhibitors, because they're not paid to give PARP inhibitors. They're paid to give chemo, IV chemo. And that's something we need to address in this country, how we're reimbursing. And it's because it makes choices that aren't showing up on a spreadsheet.
We will capture that. I apologize that I wasn't able to weave that in earlier. It's a very important point.
Well, I mean, so why is PARP inhibitors being given at academic centers? We're typically not tied to our reimbursement being from drugs.
All right, thank you very much. And opportunity for savings?
Well, I think
Lower salaries for academic? No.
even lower salaries, that's good. Yeah, I mean, I think the waste issue is good, but I think centralization of care is very critical, or partnering with experts that maybe can understand how we can deliver high-value care is appropriate. And we all have to have a value formula in every decision we make.
Thank you very much. Betsy.
I second everything that was said.
I promise I have to leave to the airport. So thank you. Thank you so much for including me.
Thank you. You'll hear your applause on the way to the airport.
I think the value of looking at progression-free survival as an important endpoint is especially crucial for ovarian cancer and any other rare cancers like that, where you die or you have a longer period without progression. And I think for all the adverse, well, for a number of the adverse effects of some of the chemos, nausea, fatigue, neuropathy, I think there are cheaper ways to address those problems through integrative therapies like Reiki, reflexology, mindfulness training, acupuncture, that have been shown in clinical studies. So, you know, rather than buying all of the laxatives in the pharmacy, there are other things that you can do.
Okay.
They're cheaper.
Thank you very much. Susan?
Well, since all the good answers have been taken, I think the number one takeaway is, first of all, I appreciate the fact that ICER has involved the patients so much in this conversation, and I think that needs to be continued across everything from clinical trial design on. Because if we're involved up front, we're not so likely to be the ones that have this impact them in a negative way. So I appreciate that, and I think we need to continue it. As far as waste, I've already thrown my 2 cents out about CA125, and of course monitoring with CT scans, I totally agree with you that that can be overused a lot, you know. But one of the other things that is so critical is educating not only physicians, but nurses and nurse practitioners about the treatment of ovarian cancer so that they know about centralized care. They know where to refer their patients. That's it.
Good, thank you. Harold?
Yeah, I think innovation is thriving. When you look in the drug pipeline, it's thriving and it's not going to dry up beyond popular belief. And from a waste perspective, what I would say is that it's really continuing to better identify the patients that are going to respond to treatment the best, and putting controls in place from whether that is utilization management, it's formulary, it's value-based contracting to really align the costs associated with these products with the outcomes that they're truly bringing to patients. Those would be my big areas of waste where we see today.
All right, thank you. All right, so let's run around the CEPAC circle now. And with about 15, even less maybe time left. So you guys luckily only have to do one sentence. You don't have to find the waste. If you have some ideas, please feel free to include that, but it doesn't have to be your cup of tea. So Rena, we'll start with you and go around this way, and so that we can end with the chair. So Rena, please a final statement. So just given the time, we're going to try have everybody have your comment be around 30, 45 seconds if you can.
I just want to thank all of the participants for an incredibly hard and thoughtful look at a very difficult and exciting area of medical progress. The economic issues and the clinical issues are both highly uncertain, and we have to keep talking to each other.
Thank you. Great. Scott?
This is my 4th meeting, and I always walk away with such appreciation how ICER is moving the needle on these things, whether it's conversations in St. Louis or Chicago or Boston or wherever you have them. It's so meaningful, and I hope that we individually then carry that forward. I know patient representatives and advocacy groups are, but you know, the panel members that aren't up here, I think we all would like to see industry up here and help us move that needle. So thanks again to all the panel members, ICER, the rest of our group. Really a great conversation today.
Thank you, Scott. Jermaine?
Thank you for this open dialogue, and thank you for including me as part of it. Thank you.
So this is my 2nd meeting. Haven't said much. Again, I'm taking this all in. First, I want to thank Susan and Betsy and the patient advocacy groups. I think we got a lot of great information today. The expert clinicians, again, valuable. The ICER staff, wonderful effort. I think what strikes me most about this is the inconsistency in the research information. From a knowledge management standpoint, it's all over. This sort of inconsistency in terms of the lack of multiple comparable trials, head-to-head comparisons, lack of quality of life measures, lack of comparable populations, variations in dosing and formulations, differences in outcome measurements and how which outcome measures are most important. I found it fascinating. I thought it was interesting how we moved from sort of identifying all these challenges in terms of our knowledge management here to really a comfort in listening to the clinicians and the patients describe it, and I felt reassured. I felt comforted by that there's the experience that was going to help me make some decisions in my voting. So I think finally I just say I remain deeply concerned, as I was the last time, with access issues. You talk about 150,000 or more, and the impact that has on uninsured Americans. So I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah, I want to thank everyone that came today and participated, especially Susan and Betsy. I learn so much every time as a non-clinician, medical clinician. And I think every time we have a meeting, it reminds me why health reform in this country is so difficult, because it's personal. Healthcare is so personal. And I think it also gives me some perspective on why it's so hard for policymakers to struggle with these issues. And I truly think the answers are going to come from industry and consumers and geeky researchers like myself sitting down together. And there isn't a magic wand that's going to fix our healthcare system. So I just appreciate continuing to learn.
Thanks, Ryan. Rachel.
I just want to echo the thanks that everyone has already brought up, and thank you all not just for being here and speaking with us, but for bearing with us while we struggle to understand what it's like to treat patients, to be a patient with this condition, to experience the quality of the evidence here. And I think you heard us struggle with that, not just in terms of where the trials are, in terms of collecting the evidence they're designed to collect, but in terms of, unfortunately, the kinds of trials that industry has chosen to conduct and the kinds of information they have not chosen to give us. So I agree that there are data that we would very much like, and my hope is that with groups like ICER sort of shining a light on what information we do have, we can help be part of changing that conversation going forward. So thank you guys for being with us.
Great. Jill.
I agree, and I think I continue to be frustrated with the level of data, and I honestly worry about the cost of a drug, if ever there were to be one that actually cured anything. What on earth would that cost? And so I think I applaud ICER as well on many levels, but in simply trying to be part of the solution. Thank you for having me.
Okay. Don.
I was telling Jill, if the man says it's not about the money, an Irish saying, if the man says it's not about the money, 6-1, it's about the money. And if the oncologist and the patient say it's not about the money, it's definitely about the money. And that's in the context of a point, but I want to just say that this has been very personal for me. It's brought back some memories of my mother and her struggle with ovarian cancer, and I want to thank you for being heartfelt about that, because it really touched me. In particular, though, the light that came on in my head, Steve, is that, especially when we're talking about cancer, but it could be any other illness, with respect to the science side of what we're doing, we're not paying attention to very explicit interventions for advanced care planning. And I'm not talking about end-of-life care. That's what people immediately go to. But as Randy Pausch said, how you want to live and not how you want to die, right? And so I think we need to do a better job of building in interventions between the oncologist and the patient It's done informally, I think. I don't think there's structure to it. And I don't think we have training for the rest of the healthcare system to do this. And I think there's value in that that needs to be captured, because that's ultimately, I think, what drives the opportunity to achieve success. But overall, I agree, this was a great session, so thank you.
Chair.
So I'm grateful for today. Wonderful discussion, which only happens because people open up and share, and that's how you get good discussion. So I appreciate all the CEPAC members and our patient partners and the clinical experts and the ICER team for their full participation today. I kind of wrote down a couple quotes from today that I think, for me, sort of sum it up. I think Lisa said something, the publication of this report is premature. And I thought about that, and I said, you're right, it is premature. But I'm glad that we didn't wait for all of the data to become available to approve these medications, right? And so the FDA uses limited amounts of information in order to approve drugs, to put them in the hands of clinicians and health insurance companies and patients to sort of make them available. And then there was one other quote I think Betsy had today, which I found made me uncomfortable, but it was so true. And I think she said, we're quantifying hope. And it's hard, right, to hear that when we were talking about numbers and we're talking about trying to assign value to things. And so I appreciate those very honest and direct words, but I took them in a different way, which was, at least we are trying to quantify hope, right? And that you're right, this is an area in which there has been some innovation, there is hope, and now we're talking about trying to quantify hope rather than describing a situation in which there is none. And so I just appreciate everybody's participation today, but I kind of leave us on that note of that things are looking better, and it's because of advocates and patients and clinicians who study this so deeply. So thanks.
That was great. Thank you, everybody. So just very briefly, I also want to thank the members of the Policy Roundtable. As a reflection of our hope to be able to engage with people in kind of a respectful, open dialogue around these issues, you guys have just been spectacular. And the fact that you were able to come, that you did spend your own time in coming here, I just want to thank you for doing that and for really contributing the core of what this afternoon is all about. So from everybody, I'd like to thank you for that. And CEPAC, you guys, again, did a great job wrestling with challenging data, with all of the uncertainties that we've already talked about. A couple of just brief reflections. I'd like to thank the others who came to give public comments, the companies and the other patient groups, to come and spend your time and participate and to make comments like that and to listen. We hope to continue to learn from how we can engage with all the different kinds of perspectives. But thank you for the spirit in which you came and contributed as well. And I have two just slightly very different feelings. One was a point that I had never expected to come up, and it caught me by surprise. It was around disparities. And it made me think what was missing here was a reflection on the impact of the whole structure of the healthcare system and the delivery of these innovations. Yes, the way they're priced and insured, but everything. How does that affect poor people in this country? People who might not live in a big city, people who might not have access to the latest information. And we might, on ICER's side and on CEPAC's side, think a little bit more about how we engage with those kinds of issues in the discussions that we have, because I thought it was just a really important thing that was raised. And the other is just this kind of feeling of tension that remains, that's driven by the excitement around the innovation and the sense that we seem to be innovating and creating and delivering in a model that, as it becomes more successful on the innovation and science side, creates even more problems with being able to afford it in a way that is fair and can be made sustainable. And that the way out of that can be very ugly if we don't do it together and as transparently as we can. So there's a danger out there, and it is presented by, treatments that seem to be heaped on each other because that's the right thing to do clinically, but where the price just kind of keeps expanding. It may be reflected by the fantastic science that will be at the next CEPAC meeting here, in which we'll be looking at a gene therapy treatment, which may be considered a cure for childhood blindness. And what will the price of that be? So with innovation and excitement and all of that around us, we have to continue to work hard on thinking about value and thinking about how we create a sustainable platform for this innovation that we ultimately can afford as patients, which we're all ultimately going to be. So thank you again for today, everybody's participation. The final version of this report will come out in about 2 weeks, at which time there will be a kind of a summary of these votes and a discussion. The discussion never in our report can capture what we write, can never capture what really happened today. So again, thank you for being here, those of you who are here in person and watching on the web, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.